So, as with many jurisdictions around the world, this government right now is very much seized with the need to improve diversion, reduce plastic waste, and tackle litter. The government's made an Ontario Environment Plan convince Ontario to transition its existing recycling programs to a new extended producer responsibility framework. So again, I can't stress enough that we see this as an evolution of the recycling framework in Ontario, and we're looking for your feedback on how to make sure these regulations work for you. The key elements include an outcome-based regulation to reduce burden, flexibility and innovation to meet requirements through the market. So this is going to be a market-based approach. Improved oversight to verify environmental outcomes, and a seamless transition for consumers and citizens. And that one is particularly important as we move forward with some of the bigger programs. So at a high level then, 10,000-foot level, this is, I think, what we could frame our conversation around today. And the folks at the authority at RIPRA will definitely deepen this picture throughout the morning. But the regulation works as follows. A producer reports their supply to their annual supply to the Resource Productivity and Recovery Authority. So I'm just going to call that the authority. And that's an annual report. So it's a once annual report. And then the authority assigns a producer an obligation based on the regulations. So that's primarily, and most importantly, probably a target, but there's other obligations as well that producers need to be aware of. We'll get to those. Then the producer goes to the market to meet those obligations. They can either meet them individually, create their own response as an individual producer, or they can hire a pro to meet those obligations. And then either the pro or the producer once annually reports that they've met those obligations to the authority. So that in a nutshell is sort of the cycle that's put in place by the regulation. And I think one of the things I want to stress on this slide is that it is an annual report. It's an annual report of supply, an annual report of what you've achieved. Any other reporting is something that might happen with the pro or whatever that you need for business relationships. That is in the market. That is, I guess, your business, right? The government wants to know just those two key pieces of data. So if we go forward, then the key elements of an EPR regulation. So one of the big moves here, of course, is that the regulation is replacing the government-approved stewardship plans that we have today. So the government is no longer going to be in the business of reviewing and approving plans. And as the last bullet, if I could just skip to the bottom of the slide here, it means that we're getting out of the business of some of the operational elements of recycling programs that governments don't necessarily need to be involved in. We're more focused on the outcomes. And the regulated outcomes, the Act, the Resource Recovery and Circular Economy Act, gives us fairly broad authority to create those outcome-based regulations on a number of fronts, like a number of elements. But some of the key elements include a hierarchy of producers that are responsible for meeting those outcomes, the materials to be collected, the collection and management requirements for those materials, and the registration and reporting requirements. And I'm sure many of you have either experienced with the tire regulations or have seen the battery and electronics regulations that have been posted on our website for consultation for some time now. If you look at those, you'll see those elements coming through in the regulations. They seem fairly long. So the battery one, I think, is at 30 pages or something like that. But I think if you compare that to a stewardship plan and the kind of detail that you might have seen the government looking at before, we think that the regulations are meant to be a simplification and they're meant to be outcome-based. So looking for your feedback on that as we move forward and as we go through the conversation today. So in addition to the regulation, another really key element, and it's central in the Act, if you look at the Act, is the authority. The authority is sort of the hub around which all of this works. The authority provides oversight, compliance, and enforcement, and the scope of the authority is specified in regulation. And on that point, the authority is not making policy. That's still with the government. We're writing the regulations. We're outlining the outcomes that need to be achieved. There's some things that the regulation tell the authority to do, for instance, create guidelines on certain elements of how to recycle and how to go about audit guidelines, for instance, that kind of thing. But that's specified in the regulations. So the authority, in my time in this job, I've heard questions about what will the authority regulate, what kind of policy will the authority create. I think I want to stress that it's, as Frank said in the opening statements, the authority there is to enforce the framework, and its role is scoped out in the regulation. So the policy-making function and the regulatory function remains with the minister and the ministry. It collects data, and that's really important. A core function of the authority, as you're going to hear this morning, is the registry and the data that we need for oversight and enforcement. But it only collects the data needed for that compliance and oversight function. So it's not going to collect the same amount of data that you might be reporting, say, to a stewardship organization today is not necessarily the same data that you're going to be reporting to RIPRA in the future. Again, it's annual reporting. Costs are recovered through fees to regulated parties, so it's not on the taxpayer. And with that comes a number of oversight functions, oversight requirements and transparency requirements, annual plans, consultation on fees. And so if you're having questions, as Frank said, about the transparency and accountability authority, for sure we want to hear about them and we want to talk about them, but they are in place. So it is meant to be a modern oversight function for that authority. So there are so I've talked about the reporting requirements for producers or their pros, but also service providers, processors, haulers have to register with the authority, and they have some reporting and record-keeping requirements as well. And we'll get into those throughout the day. But again, those are meant to be a reduction from kind of the oversight that you might need from government today. It's meant to be fairly simple, and so we want to hear your feedback on that. And all of that is meant to create verified data to support public confidence in the diversion results. So at the end of the day, everyone's speaking the same language, looking at the same set of numbers to decide if the regulated outcomes have been met. So the next one is supporting competition efficiency and innovation, and I'm glad I haven't met, but I'm glad that there's someone from the Competition Bureau here today to help us unpack those competition elements of that. That's great to see. The framework is meant to facilitate easy movement of producers between service providers. So as a producer, you need to only achieve your regulated outcomes. That's what you're required to do. And you can do that in a number of ways. And the Producer Responsibility Organization, or PRO, is a service provider in this framework, not a government-mandated stewardship organization. So you don't have to use the PRO that you're using today. You can find a different service provider that meets your needs, or you can go, as we've written here, straight to the market. In other words, you can find, if you have a product that works through an individual, you can figure out an individual take back to meet your obligations. You could figure out another way to meet your obligations under the regulations. So the idea is to allow multiple pros to evolve, or a few pros and then a few single industry solutions. It's meant to provide that flexibility in the market. The data collection and oversight that we mentioned on the previous slides is meant to help that and ensure that there's a level playing field. So no one is downplaying their recycling requirements or any other requirements in the reg. They're being held to the same standards. They're competing on a level playing field. It's expected that this whole framework, we hope, will save money. It's meant to save money. It's meant to save burden. We may talk about this later. We think that we've seen savings in the tire market already for recycling costs. And so there's kind of two elements of saving money. There's the reduced burden, which ideally should save money, but there's also the increased flexibilities for pros and producers to find the most efficient recycling solution without having to come back to government to modify a plan every time. So that is the other kind of big source of savings. The next thing I want to talk a bit about is working across Canada. We've heard that there's a concern from large producers that they have relationships with a large national pro and they don't want to give that up for an Ontario-specific model. And we don't think that that has to happen. We still think that large national producers can work with a large national pro and continue to meet their obligation as they do right now. It's slightly different in different provinces, and you can continue to do that. The pro would run the program in Ontario and report on the results. The key difference for Ontario, though, and embedded in the legislation and the regulation, is that individual producers remain legally accountable for meeting their management targets, not the pro. So the reporting is the producer's individual supply, and the results are against that. So that is one of the key sort of elements of this plan, is holding the individual producer accountable for those results directly. And as you all know, one of the key goals of EPR, or Extended Producer Responsibility, is to drive some environmental benefit in product design and in recycling. We feel that when the producers are individually accountable for their results, it's expected that they will be more active in ensuring that those results are met. We also feel that over time, there's an opportunity for the pro to respond to producers who are doing more in product design to improve recyclability, or to reduce the cost of recycling, to reflect that in the fees or the contracts that are developed between a pro and a producer. And the Ontario regulations also include some more direct levers to drive environmental outcomes. For instance, in the electronics reg that's out for consultation right now, for things like recycled contents, extended warranties, those things have benefits that reduce your obligation under the regs. So the amount of material that you'll need to recover is less, and that's meant to be an incentive for that kind of activity built into the regulation. So I said at the outset that one of the key interests and goals of the government is to ensure a seamless transition, and that's absolutely the case. As Frank mentioned, the authority oversees the transition plans or wind-up plans for the existing programs and approves those. And we work with the authority to ensure that the wind-up plans, that our regulations are ready on the date that the wind-up plan is meant to wind up, and that we're ready to go when the new program comes into place. And ideally, the consumer or the citizen is not going to see any difference. This change that we're talking about today is on the back end, and on the front end, on day one, the consumer and citizen continues to get their material recycled. Over time, that may change as producers take control of the system, but that'll be for producers to decide how they want to engage with consumers and citizens. So next steps. 5 minutes on transition to the new EPR framework in Ontario. So as you all know, I think the used tire program is completed, and we have 3 regulations that are coming down the pipe. The battery regulation and the waste and electronic regulation is on the EER environmental registry today. It's out there. Happy to talk about that after. We hope to be completing that soon, so that should be out and in effect in 2020. The Municipal Hazard and Special Waste Program we need to start consulting on in the new year, and we hope to have that in place by 2021. And then, of course, the big one is the Blue Box program, which we just launched last week, a series of working groups and consultation to develop that regulation over the next year, and we hope to have the regulation in place in 2021. And then there's a much longer transition for that program, which I'm happy to talk about, but it has producers taking responsibility between 2023 and 2025. Thank you.